This is the north arm of the Fraser River at Fraser River Park. It's near Marpole, a neighborhood of Vancouver, flows past unceded Musqueam territory, and is located near an entrance to British Columbia's longest river. It was my granddad's favorite part of the river to navigate. He operated tugboats his whole life. The first tugboat my granddad worked on was the Young Hustler. It was a small, capable tugboat that he would use to pull log booms into sawmills and help bigger tugs with their tows through the bridges. It was the time of the Great Depression, and the north arm of the Fraser River was where the work was. This is Young Hustler number 2, one of 2 tugboats named Young Hustler my grandfather operated in the 1930s, as it motored along the north arm of the Fraser River at Marpole. Today, Vancouver International Airport is on the other side of the river, on Sea Island. Eventually, factories, marinas, and mills would rim the river's shores, but back then the south side of the river was made up of low-lying marshes, farmers' fields, and very little in the way of industrial development. My granddad's name was Jack Hughes, and he spent his working life on tugboats. Here on the north arm of the Fraser and up and down the BC coast. But it was while he was at the helm of his first tugboat, the Young Hustler, when this is his favorite stretch of water. Jack Hughes, or John Hughes as he was named when he was born in Vancouver in 1913, came from parents John and Margaret, originally from Rosset in Wrexham Borough County in Wales. When he was 6, his parents would make their home in East Vancouver on 61st Street between Fraser and Victoria near the north arm of the Fraser, a river that would be very influential to young Jack. Paul Hughes is Jack Hughes' son and my uncle. He grew up around the tugboats that surrounded the Hughes family in the 1960s and 1970s, and although the Young Hustler days happened before he was born, Paul has become something of a guardian of family history. To find out more about Jack Hughes and his days on the river during the 1930s, I visited him on Bowen Island. We'd spend an afternoon poring over old photographs and Granddad's writing about his life on the Fraser during the Great Depression.
The Fraser was a big part of his life, not just the tugboats, but just the Fraser in general. He grew up in Marpole, and the family had a shack down on the waterfront where the Knight Street Bridge is now, on the north side of the Fraser. And they would go there, and they were just kids, teenagers, and they had a stove, and they would basically have a picnic and things. And they had a rowboat. There was always a boat somewhere with my dad, but there was a rowboat, and they'd row over to Lulu Island and steal potatoes and carrots or whatever they could get from the farms over there, and row back, and then they'd cook up a stew, in there. And basically all these, they were just teenagers, really. And my dad and his brother and my mum and a few of the other people, that were in their lives out there in Marpole. There was quite a tight group. And my impression of it was fairly idyllic, But when I look back in and what was going on in the world. It was, it was anything but.
So when whistles from the bridge, which was a sign a tow was coming upriver, were heard and I had the opportunity, I was off and running to revisit some of the tugs again. One of the favorite congregating points was the old Western Hemlock Mill in Mitchell Slough. This was only a few blocks downhill from our house and a short way from our squatter shack. From the time he was 6 years old and the family had moved to 61st Avenue, Jack spent much time down at the river with the family's boats. Jack's father built a squatter's cabin down at the foot of Argyle Street. Good memories were made there navigating the waters of the Fraser with her canoe and a powerboat with a 2-cycle engine. Young Jack would also drop by the nearby mill when he heard approaching tugs bringing in a tow of logs and would get to know the crews. There were some tough times ahead.
It was the Great Depression, and people had no money, and then the war was brewing. It was coming up, and so there was a lot of uncertainty, much like there is now.
This uncertainty meant, as my granddad put it, many people young and old couldn't get work. Everyone scrounged to make a dollar wherever they could. Meals came from the river, with the occasional bit of produce borrowed from a farmer's field, as due to the Depression, vegetables were grown but not picked because of a lack of market. People would fish from their boats in the river during the day and head out into open sea, what my granddad called the Gulf, to fish at night. The river would be a source of life for many struggling to make ends meet, but it would also provide much-needed recreation. While a young man, my granddad would meet Ethel Miller, who would later become his wife, and adventures would fill their days that would allow them to forget the troubled circumstances the world was facing.
By living this kind of nomadic kind of life they would lead on the Fraser, and they'd go everywhere. They would row up the Fraser to Pitt Lake, and they'd have picnics up in Pitt Lake, and think nothing of it, and row back.
But the seemingly idyllic existence along the north arm of the Fraser was tempered by the need to find work. It was this time when the tugs came into his life. Log boom storage and scow berthing were being established at this time. While my granddad was coming up on 20 years of age, he started to get an itch to work among a group of young men looking for opportunity where there was work to be done. Getting to know those crews at Western Hemlock Mill would pay off. I operated tugs for Harry Bird and Bird and Reed, Young Hustler and Young Hustler No. 2. In the early 1930s, Amos Beckman lost his tug, the Tugaway, due to fire. Harry Bird and Happy Campbell were boom men at the Western Hemlock Mill in Mitchell Slough, and later they moved into the towing by providing service at the Marpole area. They had a 30-horsepower Vivian gas engine to start, but they later rebuilt and strengthened the hull and powered her with a 4-cylinder, 80-horsepower Vivian diesel engine. I believe this was either the first or second diesel engine made by Bill Vivian of Vivian Engine Works. They called the boat the Young Hustler.
So the river became part of my dad's story, and it's impossible to talk about him without really mentioning it, because, whenever he talked to me about his early days, it was always with the backdrop of the Fraser in it. And of course, he started his career on the tugs there with working on the Young Hustler. And I know he loved it. There was nothing he loved better. He used to tell me that, he'd go down as a kid before he was working there. He'd go down and he'd talk to the guys on the boats, on the tugs, right? They'd sit around the galley having coffee, and they'd talk, and Dad became part of that, and that's where it started. He wanted to be like those guys.
In 1932, after having obtained a radio certificate but unable to get any work with it as the Depression was still on, I was offered a chance to go to work on a local tug operating out of Marpole called the Young Hustler. Needless to say, I jumped at the chance. No salary was mentioned. I would have gone for nothing, but after a shakedown period, I was rewarded by the handsome stipend of $28.50 a month.
Yeah, he would have done it for nothing. Yeah. I think he was quite amazed at, oh, what do you mean I get paid too?
It was a wonderful trip to leisurely wind your way upriver through Marpole. Just the smell off the low-lying marshes and farmers' fields was something to remember. Today, this has all changed with airports, factories, mills, and marinas everywhere you look.
These words from Jack Hughes' memoirs certainly do sum it up. Things really have changed. But in an eerie way, they haven't. We find ourselves in an economic downturn, much like the Great Depression that Jack Hughes found himself in when he was at the helm of the Young Hustler in the 1930s. I wonder what wisdom he might have for me, his grandson, around now. But maybe the best thing to do is to read his words and take the hint from the name of his first tugboat.
Young Jack really did hustle while at the wheel of the Young Hustler. He didn't know it then, but he would stay on working for Burt and Reed for another 10 years. It was varied work, and it would keep him going through the years of the Great Depression.
And they towed logs, I think, mostly, up and down the Fraser, so they would yard them up, you know. He spent many, many years doing that in the late 30s. That's what kept Body and Soul together. Mum and he were married in 38, and so he was working then on the Young Hustler.
The work was always different, and time flew by, and although the hours were horrendous and the pay worse, it was a time that I really enjoyed. Our regular work was putting booms of logs and scows into the various mills, helping larger tugs with their log tows through the bridges, tending dredge, and assisting scows up and down through the bridges. Hard times made Jack Hughes resourceful, and he was grateful to have work to do that had him navigating the river he loved alongside the men he respected. Once the Depression had really taken hold, many lumber mills that took in logs were forced to close down. In Marpole, he recalled only a handful were still in operation, two being Eburn sawmills and BC Box. This meant he had to work hard to be productive.
He didn't take a day off, really. Dad worked all the time, you know, all day, every day, and long hours. And they worked when their lives were governed by the tides, and so they worked with the tide, you know. And so it was difficult. I mean, it was, but he loved everything about that, you know. To see, he learned so much, and he took that information and just grew with it.
My granddad's regular work was to help larger tugs with their big tows get through the bridges, and also tending dredge, which was to help ships scour the bottom of the river and ensure that it was navigable.
And that involved working alongside larger tugboats like Point Pelly and Knockabout, helping the old dredge Georgia, and the tug Wee Grant, doing the tending work. But it was working alongside the old snag boats that really interested young Jack. It went up and down the river, pulling snags and doing survey work. There is a real nostalgia connected with these old steamboat sternwheelers. It was interesting to watch the snag puller operate, pulling up dead heads and putting them ashore in slack water behind some point, where they would stay anchored out of the main current. The work certainly was varied, but there was one bit of work on the young hustler which was out of the ordinary. I don't know whether it was because we had colder weather or not, but the Fraser froze over solid. We had the job of breaking ice and keeping it moving out to the open Gulf of Georgia. I recall once the Vancouver Lions hockey team held 2 or 3 practices between the bridges at Marpole.
Considering how complex a river system this is, all the tributaries that go into it and generate its power, it's extraordinary to me to think that this froze during the winters in the 1930s. And of course, this is just the north arm of the river here at Fraser River Park. But going up as powerful a river as the Fraser, even during my grandfather's days in the 1920s and 1930s, was a team effort.
At times, 6 to 8 tugboats would be tied up together. As the crew stayed with tow till it was delivered, there were some great bull sessions between the men from different companies. As the tugboats were paid by the month and no regular days off, the men most of the time stayed aboard. There was far more camaraderie in knowing each other in those days than exists today, as it is a whole new ballgame. It was the work of helping larger tugs, negotiating their log booms through half tide and slack water, that would be the most time-consuming work. Sometimes it took a couple of days or so to deliver a tow to New Westminster or beyond. This would mean that when the tide was against the tugs helping a larger tug, the boats would pull into a convenient place for the crew to get ashore. It was during these times of waiting, where the tide determined their work hours, that Jack Hughes would enjoy the fellowship between the crews. Granddad in his later days lamented how, with an increase in time off, more of a Monday to Friday work week, it was seldom that the same crews were together as often. Back in his days, larger tugs had a crew of 6 to 8 men, and when he wrote his notes, it was common for 4 to crew a seagoing tug, only 2 for harbor vessels. The land rimming the north side of the river at the mouth of the North Arm is a Musqueam reserve. Back in the Depression years, young Jack saw the Musqueam Reserve as a vibrant village. With the church and the clusters of homes well back from the river and separated by a low marshy area which was connected by numerous channels to the river, most of the people fished and beachcombed logs, dug clams and oysters. It was a period when these people lived very much as they had from the beginning of time. Across from the Musqueam Reserve is Iona Island, from the west end of which the jetty extends. Between Iona Island and Sea Island is the McDonald Slough, and at high water offered an alternate route to the open Gulf. This had now been filled in with a causeway, and the upper end is used for log storage. The bay created by the causeway continues to be a protected place for tugs to store their log booms. In my grandfather's day, McDonald Slough was another channel out into the Strait of Georgia. However, today, Iona Beach Causeway closes it off. The road takes vehicles to Iona Island Treatment Plant and Iona Beach Regional Park. But at one time, this channel led out to the open sea, which in calm weather and the tides worked in your favor, could be a pleasant experience. And sometimes, things went wrong with your tow. Sometimes, log tows would break up when changing direction and entering the north arm of the Fraser, and the logs would disappear into these numerous channels. And these logs would be valuable to the mills upriver, and sometimes these logs would be delivered in smaller tows by smaller boats. But smaller loads would have to wait at the mills for the larger outside tugs delivering large tows, my granddad recalled. These were deep draft vessels, which meant they were lower in the water and displaced more water. Unless the tide was at high water, these larger tugs, pulling large log booms, wouldn't be able to travel upriver, as the river depth was not maintained by dredging as well as it is today. Sometimes if these tugs arrived at the river too early, they had to wait until at least half tide, when they'd have enough water underneath them to proceed. Young Jack remembered a few exciting times when towboats arrived a little early on the tide, but the weather and sea conditions were deteriorating. Quite a few tows wound up on Point Grey shore and had to be salvaged. This was a disaster for a tug captain and his crew, not to mention dangerous. So Granddad would find himself offering assistance to these larger tows and the young hustler, guiding their large loads around Marpole Bridge. When circumstances required it, space to store the logs being towed, or booming ground space as my granddad termed it, was usually found at Point Grey Flats, an area at the mouth of the north arm of the Fraser still used for log boom storage today. Jack Hughes recalled that the storage of logs in these shallow, protected waters most of the time meant they had been aground. This would mean less log spoilage by the teredo worm. This little beast, also known as Teredo nivalis, or naval shipworm, was a kind of clam that was, and still is, good at damaging wood by chomping into it, and was best to be avoided. He recalled the North Arm jetty not being as pronounced in those days, and so logs here were vulnerable to westerly winds. So a few hulks were brought in and stranded in position to afford some protection at high tide when the westerly winds were blowing. A temporary fix to be sure, but the jetty was extended over the decades and now offers more protection to the log booms stored there. Nearby, there were people young Jack Hughes admired. He recalled a skilled Japanese fishing community, but he was reluctant to tell of the treatment of its people later, during the Second World War. The Celtic shipyards had shops, boat moorage, and a deep inlet about a half-mile long which was used to store the boats. This is where the Japanese people had their settlements at the foot of Blenheim Street. These people were all put in camps during the war. In the course of this mass confiscation and impounding of fishing vessels, many injustices were committed. I personally don't think we have much to be proud of.
He had a varied life, always with that thread of the sea and the river in it, and I think he was happiest whenever he was talking about it or whenever he was on it. That was his thing.
I'm proud that he made the most of what was a difficult time for many. I'm proud that he developed a strong work ethic and worked hard at what he loved to do. I've connected with my granddad by learning more about his time, and I see the river now in a whole new way. My granddad's days along the north arm of the Fraser, while working through the Great Depression on the Young Hustler, were some of the happiest days of his life.
He was, I think if he had to look back, I think he would remember that time of his life was probably the best time for him. Yeah. But for Dad, that was the only choice. He was never happier than when he was on the boat.
He would work on the river, live by the river, and find his community along the north arm of the Fraser. He would meet his future wife there. He would live in a cabin along the river with several boats, and after the young hustler, he would find more tugboats to work on. He would build a career on tugboats, working on the Sorg, the Sea Venture, and the Sea Rover, and eventually created his own company. Hughes Towing Company would emerge from the experience Jack Hughes found and built upon during the Great Depression on the north arm of the Fraser, working on the young hustler. He would have a family of his own, and he would put his sons to work on the Hutoko Queen, Peter, my father Michael, and Paul.
Formed his own company eventually, and with his brother, they started butte towing after that, and then finally Dad started Hutoko, which is short for Hughes Towing Company.
It was a great holiday to take a camping trip and stay on the jetty for a few days, as we did many times. At low tide, you can walk for miles on the hard sand or watch the marine life trapped in the numerous pools by the dropping tide. After, when the water covered the hot sand, it made for great swimming, and on the nights settling before a fire, watching the deep sea ships and the CPR night boats going to and from Vancouver was a memorable sight. Progress is a great thing, but it would be grand if we could turn back the clock for a week or two and revisit the old river as it once was. The North Arm Jetty, the entrance to the north arm of the Fraser, looks a little different than it did during the Great Depression. You can't camp overnight these days as it's a part of Iona Beach Regional Park, but I can walk its length as far as the tide will let me. Point Grey Flats, still in use today by tugboats and their crews, the place my granddad Jack Hughes would have sheltered from the open water, stored his tow while he waited for the tide, the gateway to his favorite stretch of the Fraser at Marpole. Entering the north arm of the Fraser at the jetty outer beacon about a mile from Point Grey and using a dredged channel, it was possible using only a rowboat to take advantage of the flood tide to leisurely find your way right up to New Westminster and even beyond without much exertion. On the port side, about a mile from the mouth, 2 old ship hulks were sunk and beached to act as a breakwater from strong westerly winds, thus protecting the log booms which were stored on the Point Grey Flats. At all times of the year, the strong river current eases off and changes to flood about 1 to 1.5 hours after low water.
Well, as my granddad was governed by the tides when he was working on the young hustler, I seem to have been cut off by the tide here, but not before I've managed to see a quite large section of the North Arm Jetty. The sand dunes kind of run out here and it just becomes artificial reef, pile upon pile of rock, going out to the beacon at the end of it. And my granddad really knew those tides. He lived by them. And this would have been the entryway to his favorite bit of water, the north arm of the Fraser.